I read that also the Nazi government used a bunch of IOUs for their industry to fund the early mechanization of the military.
Yeah. They basically, I mean, Hitler had no idea about John Maynard Keynes, but John Maynard Keynes was an economist in England who said that basically when you get into a depression, the first impulse of people like Herbert Hoover is to say, oh my gosh, the economy is crashing, the government is not taking up enough in taxes to pay for everything it's supposed to do, so we're going to slash government services to balance our budget. And they thought that was the best way to respond to a depression, was to slash the government spending because you don't want to go into debt. But John Maynard Keynes says, you know what, actually the problem with a crashing economy like you have in the Depression is that there's not enough money in circulation. So what the government should do is simply start borrowing money and spending it to pump money into the economy. He used the phrase "prime the pump." You gotta pump some money into the economy, and then once the economy starts to get going again, it'll pick up on its own. But the government has to do that. So you should deficit spend like crazy. Hitler had no idea about this. Hitler was not an economist, but he wanted to get ready for war, so the first thing he does as soon as he gets into power is he has the German government start borrowing money to rearm the country, and he starts hiring people in armaments industries and et cetera, and he primes the pump without realizing what he's doing, and Germany actually pulled out of the Depression way earlier than France or England or the United States or anything, because he did it perfectly. He also started World War II in the process, but which had negative effects on Germany ultimately. But in the meantime, in 1919, when the Treaty of Versailles finally promulgated, all that is humiliating for Germany. The loss of Alsace and Lorraine in Poland is humiliating for Germans. They feel like they've had a limb cut off or something. The military restrictions, they can't be a military power, is really humiliating. The reparations, having to pay Germany and France for the privilege of fighting war against them, is humiliating. And then the demilitarized zone, they can't even station troops in their own country, is humiliating, right? And then there were other things that added to this. The Germans didn't pay, they were falling behind on reparations in 1922 and 23, and so the French sent in French troops to seize a coal mining region of northern Germany, and they just started taking all the coal as reparations. And this was really humiliating for the Germans, that the French are just going into their country and taking stuff. But it was super humiliating for the Germans because the French sent in Senegalese French troops who were they're from Africa and they're black, and the Germans felt this is a super humiliation because it was colonized peoples taking stuff from Germany. It was like the ultimate humiliation of people you're supposed to be colonizing are colonizing you, Of course, there's all that's all based on racism. So this was humiliating for Germans, but there were other ways in which the Austro-Hungarian Empire came off even worse. They ceased to exist. Well, Austria and Hungary continue to exist, but basically, here's where Woodrow Wilson got his wish. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, they just got down on their hands and knees on a map on the floor with markers, and they said, they printed out maps showing all the language groups in Europe, and then they basically just drew lines around the language groups and said, okay, this is going to be a country, and this is going to be a country, and this is going to be a country. And sometimes it was, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was Vienna. And the Habsburgs had run the Austro-Hungarian Empire for 400 years, 500 years. And they ruled, it was an empire of 55 million people. It was parts of what we would today call Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, Yugoslavia, into Bulgaria, Romania. All that got taken away. And Vienna went from being the capital of an empire of 55 million people to being the capital of a country of 6 million people, which was really seen as humiliating for Austrians. It's like, now we're an insignificant little country that doesn't mean anything, and we were one of the big boys in Europe before this. And then they created a whole bunch of countries out of that. They also took a bunch of territory from Russia. Russia was embroiled in the Civil War, with the Bolsheviks, communists versus everybody else. And Russia was fighting the Civil War, and so while they weren't really looking, a bunch of countries declared their independence and got their independence. So overall, and you don't need to know this list, but the number of new countries that came into existence at the end of World War I, either because they declared themselves independent or because the Treaty of Versailles created them, was Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary. And Yugoslavia was created. It was essentially, they took Serbia and added all the other people who spoke Serbo-Croatian languages. So the Serbs and the Croats got stuck in the same country. And that obviously worked out really well until the 90s.
Well, yeah.
When they started
They were doing
killing each
good for
other.
a while there.
But the long and the short of it is, the Austro-Hungarian Empire ceased to exist, and both Austria and Hungary feel kind of humiliated because they're now much smaller, insignificant countries. Austria in particular is an insignificant country.
Yeah, I mean, it's really just thought of as like the weird appendage to Germany.
Yes,
Like,
exactly. I mean, the weird thing is that throughout the 19th century, there had been talk of creating a Germany. I mean, Germany, as I mentioned, up until 1870 was a whole bunch of little tiny countries. There was Prussia up in the north, and there was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is huge. And then there were all these little German principalities. And a lot of people had talked about unifying Germany in like 1848. They had a revolution and they were going to unify Germany. But they couldn't agree on whether Austria should be part of it. Because Austria was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it included 49 million non-German speakers. And so most Germans are like, no, they don't belong. They're not part of our country, so we want Austria out of it. But Austria itself is 6 million German speakers, as they felt it should be part of Austria, right? And ultimately, the so-called smaller Germany comes into existence when Prussia unifies everybody but Austria. But now, when Austria is an independent little country and it's all German-speaking, a lot of people start saying, well, Austria should be part of Germany now because it doesn't come along with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire ceases to exist, and Austrians in particular, but also Hungarians to a certain extent, feel humiliated by this. Okay.
Do they not have booths in the airport now for if you accidentally went to go to Australia?
Yeah, I've heard that is an actual thing, that there is a booth in the Vienna airport to explain to people how to get to Australia when they booked their flight to Austria and thought they were going to Australia. And in fact, my son is in the Peace Corps right now in Moldova, and he was in Vienna for a week a month ago and confirmed that.
it seems like you really gotta be not paying attention. Because like even if like Austria and Australia, those sound very similar, maybe you like missee it. But you should be going to a specific city in Australia, which is not Vienna, because you're getting a hotel room and stuff.
Yeah. You would think you'd realize if you're booking a hotel room in Canberra and your flight is to Vienna that something is not lining up right. But
I mean, maybe people just think that there's suddenly a place called Vienna in Australia.
could be.
I feel like most people who are very geography savvy are like, yeah, the capital of Australia, Sydney. So I don't know people's knowledge of Australian cities is very
Yes.
good a lot of the time.
I think it's just like a funny thing to have, though.
But I clearly summed up where they were at after no longer being empires, and now today it's you went to the wrong place. Here's a booth to fix that.
Yeah, the ultimate humiliation for the Austrians is realizing they're so insignificant nobody can tell them apart from Australia anymore, and they have to put up a booth in the airport to acknowledge the fact. But the Ottoman Empire also ceased to exist, and the countries of Turkey and Syria and Jordan and Iraq are created out of that. Those all become, except for Turkey, those all become French and British colonies, but they are technically.
I love that Woodrow Wilson's whole thing was like, let's break them up, give them their nation states, and then America as well as France and Britain all came in and said, well, but what if they were our nation states?
The thing is the United States never declared war on the Ottoman Empire. And so when the negotiations came, the French and British were like, you're out. Americans don't belong here. You didn't declare war. You weren't part of the war. We get to carve up the Ottoman Empire ourselves. And so Wilson was not in the room when they carved up the Ottoman Empire and said, we're taking it all for ourselves. But not that he could have stopped it. But so the Versailles thing was a bit of a humiliation. But another humiliation for German men in particular was that all of the nations created that I just mentioned, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, etc., were either, there were a couple of them were constitutional monarchies, but most of them were republics. And for the Germans in particular, the end of the war, I mentioned that the Kaiser couldn't bring himself to abdicate or to surrender, so he abdicated. And Germany was then sort of accidentally declared a republic because nobody knew what to do. Right?
Did he not have like an heir?
He didn't have an heir. And so German people didn't really feel like they wanted a republic. There were lots of Germans who did want a republic. The socialists were fantastically happy about it.
Yeah, sure.
But for most Germans, this was seen as another form of humiliation because in German culture up to that point, patriarchy and hierarchy, aristocrats on top, Junkers is the term for German aristocrats.
Sounds a little crazy.
They saw having a single male head of the country as being the sort of epitome of masculinity, and they felt that every man who was sort of in charge of his family had the authority because he was the male representing the Kaiser. So it's sort of like the masculinity of the Kaiser trickled down through the aristocrats and then down through the business owners. And so there's a really strong sense of paternalism in German culture, is that the male is the head of the family and the boss is the head of the family that is the factory floor, and the aristocrat is the head of the family that is the region, and the Kaiser is the head of the family that is Germany. And so there was a real sense in which every male head of household, when the Kaiser disappeared, felt to a certain extent his authority had just gotten shaky. That his masculinity was now in question. Because there wasn't a Kaiser and a strict hierarchy like that enforcing that sort of his masculine dominance, every German man sort of felt a little bit of a shakiness or an undermining of their authority, their masculinity, because there wasn't a Kaiser. And then it was even more humiliating that the party that took over the government was the socialists, who were seen as sort of feminized. They had opposed the war. The socialist parties generally felt that war was something capitalists did to make money, and so they opposed the war in principle. Now, they did come around to supporting the war, etc., but they were seen as anti-war and seen as not really masculine, and they were seen as caring for people, which is not very masculine. And so there was a lot of ways in which, it's really hard for us as Americans to understand this, but there's a lot of ways in which Germans felt having a republic led by socialists forced on them was deeply humiliating in some sense. Any questions about that? There were other things that were sort of humiliating for men in particular at the end of World War I. One was the rise of communism. Communism is, of course, an ideology that is focused on the working class rising up and staging a revolution, taking over the country. And so communism has built right into it the refutation of paternalism. We're going to rise up and overthrow the owners of the factory. We're going to rise up and overthrow the kings, and then we're going to rise up and overthrow the aristocrats. We're going to rise up and overthrow the rich. And all the people who thought they had this sort of, they were the head of the family kind of thing, feel threatened by communism. And in 1917, the communists take over in Russia, and by 1918, 19, and 20, the communists are winning the Civil War, and it's become apparent that communism is here to stay in the Soviet Union. And in January of 1919, there is a almost successful attempt at communist revolution in Germany, the so-called Spartacist revolt. the German Spartacus League, which was a communist political party. The Spartacus League tries to take over the country and stage a communist revolution. In Hungary, the Hungarian Communist Party does take over the country and stages the communist revolution, and they would actually start to transform Hungary, turn it into a communist country, and the French finally decided they weren't going to stand for that and invaded Hungary and toppled the government and instated a republic in Hungary. But for a lot of Germans, this was terrifying. I mean, even in places like Italy and France, you see new communist parties pop up emulating the Russian Revolution, saying we're going to have a revolution like that in France, we're going to have a revolution like that in Italy, and they quickly become very big, very popular political parties that are getting millions of votes. So all across Europe, there's a communist scare, and there's a Red Scare in the United States in 1919 also. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the Attorney General of the United States at the end of World War I was a guy named Palmer, and he decided that given all the communist revolutions happening in Europe, he'd better head one off in the United States, so he just went around arresting anybody who was politically suspect in the so-called Palmer raids. Anarchists and communists and immigrants and all that. He just started arresting people and throwing them in prison without charges or anything as a way of stopping communism. And so there was a Red Scare in the United States also. But in Germany, the communists took over, and they actually started, for instance, they took over Munich, the city of Munich, and they gathered together several hundred of the wealthiest people in Munich and shot them all in the basement of a hotel. And then they, said they were going to create a communist republic in Munich. And there was, they almost took over Berlin, they took over Hamburg. There was Syria, it seriously looked like there was going to be a communist revolution. And to make it really humiliating for the Germans, there were two leaders of the Spartacus League, named Karl Liebknecht, which is a really weird name. His name is Love Knight, like medieval knight.
That's cute.
Woman.
But the other leader is Rosa Luxemburg, who is a woman. The German government was, of course, run by the socialists. It's a republic, just got named in November of 1918. Now it's January of 1919, and they already are facing rebellion. And they're in a bad way because one part of the armistice that they signed in November of 1918 was that the German government had to totally send the German army home within 3 months. So in January, they were sending the last units of the German army home. They had to simply tell all the soldiers in the German army, just go home.
Just go home.
So they didn't have a military force to stop the communists. And the communists had a whole bunch of guns because a lot of them were World War I veterans who had just gone home but had taken their guns with them. And so what the German government did, and I'll talk about this next time, I guess, is the German government asked army officers, especially aristocratic army officers, to basically form their own militias from demobilized soldiers. So basically what the officers, if they were wealthy officers, and a lot of them had industrial backers, they basically said, you guys are discharged from the army, you can turn in your uniforms, turn in your guns and go home, but there are no jobs waiting for you, and if you want to, you can stay in this military unit with your buddies and I will pay you. And what are you going to do? We're going to fight the communists. And so these so-called Freikorps, which were free corps, were German veterans groups that kept their weapons and in many cases kept their uniforms and were just private militias that were sent into Berlin or Hamburg or Munich to fight the communists. And so what you see happening is open gunfights in the streets, and hundreds of people are killed, and the Freikorps basically stopped the Spartacist revolt. In Berlin, they managed to get a hold of Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg and beat them both, and mutilate their bodies and throw them in the canal. It was good. And So the Spartacist revolt, if you weren't a communist, the Spartacist revolt was kind of humiliating because it really felt like, here's the communists and here's a woman and they almost take over the country and they're killing our leading citizens and et cetera. And so it was rather traumatic in a lot of ways. Any questions about that? Zach?
Rosa Luxemburg, is she a part of the aristocracy? Because I know that was like a large German house.
Yeah,
in
I
Germany.
don't know if she's related to the aristocratic house that rules Luxembourg. I don't know.
Is that the aristocratic house that founded the country?
I think so.
The microstate.
Yes. It's a microstate. It's much bigger than Liechtenstein, for instance, or the Republic of San Marco. For the back. Yeah.
She was born to a Jewish family in Kars, Poland.
So no, she's not. She's not a German aristocrat. Any questions about that? The last thing, which we've been talking about quite a bit already, so I'll just mention it, is a lot of World War I veterans felt a real sense of sort of cognitive dissonance when they came home because they were often treated as returning heroes. Oh, you sacrificed yourself for the country, you were heroic, you fought in the war, and the public still had an image of war that was charging into battle and courageously facing the enemy guns and winning through sheer heroism, etc. But the veterans themselves, and we had the great description of this from Drew La Rochelle, they knew they spent the war on their stomachs, hiding in trenches, lying in the mud, cowering from bullets, and in many cases, soiling their pants, and they knew it was not heroic. And most importantly, they knew that jumping out of the trenches and charging the way Archie does at the end of Gallipoli is suicidal, right?
Especially with no weapons.
But they also know, by the end of the war, they have realized that this is a war of factories and bureaucracies and supply lines and logistics, and this is a war of armies of millions of soldiers, and they have realized that, in fact, even if heroism was in some sense effective, the war is so huge that individual heroism wouldn't do anything, right? Suppose you charge the enemy trenches and you survive. You've moved the trenches back one line of trenches, and then you're going to have to do it again, and then you're going to have to do it again and again, and we're talking armies of millions of people. No one soldier is going to be able to make a difference. And they sort of realized that this war was so huge that individual heroism not only was impossible, it didn't matter anyway. And so this becomes, and this will be something we really have to, we'll be watching for the rest of it, especially when you get to Saving Private Ryan, is given what World War I taught us about what heroism is possible, is there another way you can create a form of heroism in a modern industrial total war? Is that possible? And we'll see that in Saving Private Ryan they try. And Saving Private Ryan didn't make it up. They were speaking or articulating a vision of heroism that was very definitely a part of the American response to World War II. But in this case, after World War I, there's simply heroism is impossible. We're going to have some more readings in the next week about this, but the other thing is that a significant number of World War I veterans came back with permanent disabilities. They came back with no legs, or they came back with no arm, or missing an arm, or they came back with their faces horribly disfigured, or they came back with their lungs filled with mustard gas scarring, or whole other problem after problem after problem. And all of these things were things that society Western society had never seen that level of disability on that scale before. And before that, people with disabilities were supposed to be shuttled off to a state hospital or something and out of sight, out of mind, and don't worry about it. But now they've got hundreds of thousands or millions of veterans who have these issues, and what do you do with them? And for the veterans themselves, this is deeply humiliating because they don't feel like they're men anymore if they can't work or they can't, they don't have one arm and they're not able-bodied anymore. They're not men, right? Or they're diminished men somehow. Sure.
The term shell-shocked comes out after this because of the soldiers, correct?
Yes. Yeah, agree.
In the Western Front, one of the only remaining friends with, I think, Paul, they had to cut off his leg. He was like, this is what he said, these are not my words. I'd rather kill myself than be a cripple, so.
Exactly,
Well,
and that's exactly the thing. And what he's articulating is, I can no longer be a man.
Well, yeah,
And-
even before that, the first friend they visit, who once he finds out that his leg is missing, his reaction is, I wanted to be a father.
Yeah.
And all his friends are like, you still can, and half-heartedly, and of course he dies, so he can't.
Yeah.
But immediately his mind is, I can't be a man, I can't do what I wanted to do anymore because I've lost my leg.
And we'll get into this later because we actually have a reading about it, but there's an actual movement by the British government to try to convince women to marry men with veterans with disabilities because they're trying to say, these are real men, you can marry them. And, the women don't want to, and the men feel emasculated because nobody wants to marry them, and so the government is trying to fix it by convincing women to marry men who have, are missing limbs or what have you. Any questions about any of that? The final thing I want to talk about, and then we can finish the movie. A big part of masculinity at this time was the idea that a man has to be a breadwinner. And this is why having a leg cut off or something was seen as so disabling because it was thought you couldn't earn a living as a man anymore, right? You couldn't be a manual laborer or what have you. But in a larger sense, there were a whole bunch of things happening at the end of the war which meant that lots and lots and lots of men were unemployed. Those of you who had Gender Modern Europe last time know this, but essentially, in a total war, society has to reorganize its entire economy around war production. And so they stop making, furniture, and they stop making toys, and they stop making clothes so they can make tanks and, uniforms and mess kits and whatever. And nobody thought very hard. I mean, throughout the war, the government was interfering in the economy, taking over companies and forcing them to do this or do that. And nobody gave any thought to what happens at the end of the war. And so when the war ended, what all the governments in Europe did was basically just cancel all the contracts and said, okay, we're done buying stuff. War's over. But that meant that huge numbers of factories in the economy suddenly didn't have a product they could sell. Right? What they were making, there was no market for, right? There's no market for mess kits anymore. And so what all those companies did was essentially just shut down, and they took a year or two to figure out what they were going to make again, and then they retooled and bought new machinery and hired new workforce, etc. But that took several years. And so and then at the same time, you have 6 million men in the German army, and they all have to be sent home within 3 months, and so all of them go home, right? Except for the ones who joined the Freikorps. But that means that you have millions of men entering the workforce exactly when all the factories are shutting down. So you had unemployment rates that were absolutely sky high and just skyrocketing. And so for a lot of men, they felt humiliated coming out of the war, like I couldn't be heroic, it was really humiliating. Maybe they lost a limb or whatever, but all of them are facing unemployment, right? And all of them were sort of like, I put off getting married for 4 years, now I'm getting married, but they can't get a job, and in Europe at that point, if you can't support a family, you don't get married. So they couldn't even get married.
What about the middle class soldiers, they going home and just taking over the factory?
Well, yeah, if their family was, owned the factory, they would help retool it, et cetera, so they had jobs. But and if they were school teachers or something, they'd probably get a job. So they did better than working class men. But even there, suppose you were an advertiser and there's no advertising going on, what do you do? Or suppose you work for a bank and the banks are laying people off because they don't, no companies are taking loans right now. And, it's a disaster for a lot of people. But you're absolutely right. The middle class did better than the working class in terms of that. Any other thoughts on that? I will just mention that for Germany in particular, all the countries, England, France, Belgium, etc., Italy, all had sky-high unemployment, all had this sort of economic dislocation. But for Germany, it was worse because the German government had been paying reparations to France and England, and the German government decided to do that by simply printing money. They're like, oh, we have to give France a payment of 14 million Reichsmarks, let's print off 14 million Reichsmarks and hand it over. And what happens when a country prints money? Inflation. Germany saw not only inflation, Germany saw hyperinflation. Between the middle of, at the end of the war, the exchange rate between German marks and US dollars was about 6-1. So 6 marks to the dollar in 1918.
Bad.
Not bad at all. By 1923, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, so this is off the top of my head, it's going to be in the right ballpark, but by 1923 it was like 200 and something to 1. And then in the middle of 1923, it started to go up and up. And so you started to get exchange rates of 10,000 to 1, and then 300,000 to 1, 500,000 to 1. By the middle of 1924, it was more like 43 million to 1. And by the late 1924, you're talking 1.1 trillion to 1.
Oh, so just like...
Inflation prices were going up so fast.
Might as well just be bags of confetti.
Yeah, well, there was actually a joke. It's not true, but it was a joke that this guy had a wheelbarrow full of money to go buy a loaf of bread at the store, and he's wheeling it down the street, and 2 thieves come up and they push him down and they grab the wheelbarrow and dump out the money and run off with it. The wheelbarrow, that is. But literally, there's a photograph that I love. It's a picture of a grocery store. And they have a window displaying their goods, but they don't have any goods to sell because of shortages. So they have one kohlrabi, which is an ugly-looking turnip, sitting on a stand, and it's 3 million Reichsmarks for a kohlrabi. Now you might, workers would take their money. They'd insist. Workers got paid on Fridays. They'd insist on getting paid at lunch hour so they could go spend their entire paycheck at lunchtime, because if they waited till after work, it would be worth about 1/10 as much. Prices were going up that fast. And think about what this does to your life savings, right? You retire in 1918 with $3 million in the bank and you're set for life. And by 1924, that can't even buy a single kohlrabi, right? And so this caused enormous, and this hit the middle class hard because they were the ones with savings, et cetera. And the wealthy did fine because they would just buy things and then the price of whatever they bought would go up. And then, they just parked their money and it went up and down. But this was deeply humiliating for a lot of middle class people because their life savings were gone and suddenly they were poor. Some of them lost their houses if they had mortgages or what have you. But everybody in Germany was deeply precarious economically. And one of the aspects of this that we'll get into later is that you saw prostitution skyrocket. And what often happened was that teenage daughters of middle-class families would go out to be prostitutes because their family needed money and they were the only person who could make any money through prostitution because the parents didn't have any way of, they didn't have jobs and they couldn't, and they're going to lose their house or whatever, and so the daughters would go out and be prostitutes to pay for buy the family food or what have you. Any questions about that? Okay, so let's take a 5-minute break and then we will finish the movie.